Science fiction and fantasy author Michael Lauck here to talk a little bit more about the hidden gems of science fiction and fantasy. And today, I'm sure the title has given it away somewhere, 1960s science fiction films from Italy, which deserve a second look. And I know you're like, dude, what? Are you crazy? No, I'm not crazy. I'm excited about this. And I want to talk about that real quick. A lot of my friends give me crap about my YouTube videos, and they're like, why do you just shoot these on your laptop? You used to run a videography company. You've put out DVDs. You put out a web series for a long time. You put out promos for other people. You could do, but you've got to have cameras somewhere. You got to have lighting still. You got to have microphones. I do somewhere. I don't know. But what happens with this is these videos are supposed to, build up support for my books, and I never talk about my books. What I've decided to do instead is I'm trying to give back to the science fiction community, the fantasy community, by unearthing some gems and that people don't know about, or talking about some things that I think are being ignored, some viewpoints, stuff like that. What happened today is a perfect example. I sat down to work on my next book and watch the World Cup, and I'm flipping through channels waiting for the World Cup to start, and I see Turner Classic Movies is showing the 1965 Italian film Wild Wild Planet by Antonio Marghetti. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Credited as Anthony Dawson, the first of the Gamma 1 films, and I was like, I love that movie. I should talk about the Gamma 1 films in my next YouTube video. So I end up, instead of working on my book, I got 3 pages of notes. I dug out all these DVDs that I want to mention. And I sit down, and yeah, I should clean up my office. I should do that. But instead, let's just talk about some really cool movies, because that's the whole point, right? So, if you're thinking, what's going on? Italian movies, one of 2 things generally comes up. Either, A, I don't want to read movies and I don't speak Italian. And you're thinking of art house films with like Federico Fellini. I get it, right? That's not what we're talking about. Or you're thinking about really, really crappy 80s science fiction films like The Warriors of the Wasteland and those Mad Max ripoffs, or Gladiator films from the 50s and 60s. That's more what we're talking about, but that's not what we're talking about either. Italy really has a legitimate science fiction kind of pedigree, going back to, I thought the first Italian science fiction film was a 1921 film called The Mechanical Man, which I've heard of simply because it's about a robot, and it's thought to have been the first filmed fight between robots ever in history. The problem is, the film is by and large lost. It's about 80 minutes long originally, and only about 20 minutes remain, and not the robot fight, which is probably why you've never heard of it. In digging around today, I actually found that there are science fiction movies in Italy going back to at least 1913 with a film called The Fantastic Adventures of Saturno Farandola, based on the novel of the same name, which I've never heard of either. And then, when science fiction comes into vogue again in the late 50s and early 60s, you start seeing it in the Italian film industry. First, with stuff like, the first thing I thought of was 20 Million Miles to Earth, which is actually an American film, Ray Harryhausen film. It was on Svengoolie not too long ago, at the time of taping at least, where an American spaceship that's gone to Venus crashes outside of Sicily, and a little organism escapes and grows into a monster and fistfights an elephant. And really, I think they're in Italy because Ray Harryhausen wanted to have an Italian vacation. That's legitimate, whatever. But good movie shot in Italy. Not really an Italian film. It's an American film. Another case like that is The Last Man on Earth from 1964, which I think is actually an Italian-American co-production starring Vincent Price. It's an adaptation of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. And it's a pretty good movie. I don't remember if they mention they're in Italy or not. It doesn't really matter because it's not really germane to the story. What's germane to the story is that humans are pretty much gone and there's nothing but vampires left. It's a great movie. It's from, like I said, I'm pretty sure it's an Italian-American co-production. It was definitely shot in Italy, in Rome. In '65, there's a really great movie called The 10th Victim, based on Robert Sheckley's earlier story from about 1955 called The Seventh Victim, That was also, by the way, an X-1 radio show. If you listened to me a while ago talk about the old radio serials, this is one of them. So it was probably printed in Galaxy originally, and it's about a game in the future that's televised. It's the biggest sporting event in the world, and it is, you sign up to murder people, but you're also assigned to be murdered by someone, so you try to stay alive, and it's about someone trying to claim their 10th victim, which is like hitting 100 home runs or something like that. The movie very much takes a tongue-in-cheek attitude towards like the commercialization of sports and television and violence and all of that. It's a cool movie if you can find it. It's totally worth seeing. And it got a little bit of attention. Also in '65, Mario Bava, the very famous horror director who had done a science fiction film in the late '50s called The Day the Sky Exploded, did Planet of the Vampires, which is thought by a lot of people, myself included, to probably be the inspiration for the look and feel of the Alien films. It's totally worth checking out. It's definitely out there. It shows up on Turner Classic Movies and things like that. It might be in the public domain, actually. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if it's on archive.org or something like that. But you can get copies of it for cheap if it's not on satellite or anything soon. And with that these two movies got a lot of attention. And somebody at MGM was like, hey, science fiction's big. Who can make cheap science fiction movies? And they looked to Italy, and because of a 1960 film called Assignment Outer Space, Assignment Outer Space, they looked to Antonio Margheriti, who had made Assignment Outer Space about a reporter doing a human interest story on the crew of a space station. And Margheriti was originally an engineer, apparently, so he got very into the models and the look of everything, and made an attempt to do very low-budget, zero-G scenes and things like that. And MGM evidently was impressed and said, hey, this is good-looking stuff, and it is a cool movie. I know it's public domain. You can find it on Archive. Let's get this guy. So they hire him to do 4 films, the Gamma 1 series. I have 2 of them here, Wild Wild Planet being the first. All just like right on top of each other. They literally shot 4 films in like 3 months, and the idea was to put them out in drive-ins and such. They ended up going straight to TV in most cases, but they picked Margheriti. He under the name Anthony Dawson. They didn't want people to realize these were Italian films, and they're about this team. Sometimes it's the team as Gamma 1, sometimes it's the space station they're on as Gamma 1, as they defend Earth from various kind of problems. The first one, it's actually a mad scientist who's creating genetic monsters and trying to take over the world. Later, there's a runaway spaceship that's going to hit the Earth, I believe. There's definitely a runaway planet in one of them. They're interesting films. They're pre-Star Trek. They have that retro futuristic look that kind of came before Star Trek. They have rocket ships. They have the spinning space station, and because Margheriti got into all this stuff, it has a really cool look. There's a big cult following for these films. I'm part of that cult, I'll have to admit. I love them. Now, Margheriti goes on to do a couple more science fiction films. Eventually, he does Your Hunter from the Future, based on the Argentinian comic book in like 83, 84, something like that. I saw it at the drive-in as a kid with Conan the Destroyer. It's not a great movie. Probably best part of it is the theme song, which is like a ripoff of the Flash Gordon song that Queen did. And he also did a TV miniseries, I think, called Treasure Island in Space, which was for European television. I haven't ever seen it, but it's got Anthony Quinn and Ernest Borgnine, so I need to see it. Now, he wasn't the only game in town when it came to science fiction. People forget Barbarella is actually an Italian production, you know, so you might want to check that out. I don't need to talk about that. Everybody should recognize Barbarella. There's another film, 67, so right around when Star Trek's coming out, called Mission Stardust, that's based on a German series, the Perry Rodan books. I'm not super familiar with these, but I need to look into them because they're serialized novels that I think have been going on for like 50 years strong. I think there's like 200 plus of these, but I think they're still in production, you know. And it's I think the first film based on that series. Mission Stardust, occasionally called 4321 Death or 4321 Morta, but it's you know, it's interesting because of its place in literature. Another film that I would throw out there that is not great and recycles some old Japanese science fiction footage is Star Pilot. But Star Pilot, you hear about every now and then because it came out in '66, so right before Star Trek, and their Starfleet, they talk about Starfleet Command, they use the term warp drive, they use the term impulse drive and some other things, so sometimes it's cited as an inspiration for Star Trek. I don't know that that's the case, just based on when production would have been and all that, and you know, I don't know, I've never really looked into it, but it might be, but you do hear about it, it's out there. And that's kind of the highlights of 60s science fiction films from Italy. There are some other things out there. There are actually a bunch of Italian superhero movies from the 60s, and some of their spy movies, because the James Bond movies are big, have serious science fiction overtones. You might check out some of that. And then science fiction starts to wane, as it did everywhere, until Star Wars came out. And once Star Wars came out, you know, Italy was back in the science fiction business. I'm going to mention these not because they're great, but because if you start looking for Italian science fiction, this is what's going to come up probably first. And that's there's a guy, his name's Alfonso Brescia, and he did 4 films right after Star Wars, sometimes lumped together as if they're connected. They have nothing to do with each other. Starting with Cosmos War of the Planets, which is a remake of Planet of the Vampires. And then that same year he did War of the Robots, which is about aliens who kidnap Earth scientists and the rescue mission to get them back. Starring Antonio Sabata, the father of Antonio Sabata Jr. from like The Big Hit and all that stuff. Sometimes it's called Reactor. It definitely shows up in these like bundles. It's actually, I think it's in this one, Sci-Fi Invasion. It's not a terrible movie. It's not a great movie. It's out there. Brescia, though, goes on to do Star Odyssey, which is a remake of Seven Samurai in a science fiction setting. It's really not good in '79. And then because of all these films, there's a just straight up Star Wars ripoff called Star Crash. And when I say that, it's because there's robots and there's lightsabers, and it's by a guy named Luigi Cozzi, who had done way back in like '69, so right on the tail end of the '60s, the tunnel under the world, based on the Frederick Pohl novel, but I don't think licensed. I think he just based it, you know. And Cozzi's film Star Crash is often called one of the worst films ever made. It's not a good science fiction film. What makes it fun, though, is, and Cozzi's the guy who went on to do the Lou Ferrigno Hercules films, but what makes this film fun is it stars Carolyn Monroe, beautiful actress who is best known for her work in the Hammer horror films. So she's in Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, which is one of my favorite movies ever. Also, David Hasselhoff makes an appearance in Star Crash, and the bad guy is Christopher Plummer, who's General Chang in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. He's won an Academy Award. I think he might have won Tony Awards. You know, he's considered this brilliant actor, and you know, people are like, "Why did you make Star Crash?" And he said something to the effect of, you can find this on the internet, like, well, they flew me to Rome. If he said something like, I would shoot a porno film if they're shooting in Rome. So there you go. Cozzi would go on to do Contamination and some other 80s science fiction movies. And by the 80s, the Italian science fiction films kind of slip into the sci-fi barbarian stuff. There's Warriors of the Wasteland and several other kind of Mad Max ripoffs. And then they get into like Ator the Fighting Eagle and, that kind of the Wizards of Gore and that stuff. Which I'm not sure are actually Italian films, but that kind of thing, if you remember those kind of, because of Conan getting into the sword and sorcery stuff instead. But if you want my pick, we're right at 15 minutes, so I'm going to end this. If you want my pick, it's the Gamma 1 films, Antonio Margheriti, which I like so much. I am such a fan of his. One of my characters in the Black Sky Rangers, if you pay close attention, in the medical bay, is actually named after him. So there's my book plug, I guess, for the day. I'm going to get back to writing. I'm working actually on a sequel to The Grand Tournament, so if you're a fan of that, look for that. It should be out by the end of summer. And what I leave you to do now is get on Internet Archive. You're going to find a bunch of these movies. They are public domain in America. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.